transforming Zionism from ideology or a set of ideologies to the actual building of a state. Just for the sake of clarifying nomenclature, prior to independence in 1948, I will do my best not to refer to the State of Israel, only because, as a matter of historical fact, the state did not exist prior to its independence as a state when Ben-Gurion declared in May of 1948 that the state shall be called Medinat Yisrael, or the State of Israel. Prior to that, the proper term is the Yishuv, which means the settlement. Don't confuse this with the way in which settlement or settlements are used today to refer to Jewish population centers in the West Bank or prior to the withdrawal in 2005 in Gaza. Rather, settlement means where the Jews were settling all throughout what is later to be the State of Israel, and also what are today the Palestinian territories. So the Yishuv, or the Zionist settlement in Palestine, first begins under the Ottoman Empire, and then we talked about how really during the war, World War I this is, with the writing on the wall, the British and the French meet at the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement to carve up the Middle East, with the Brits taking the part of the Middle East that is going to be British mandatory Palestine. The British will have a mandate to govern. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 favored the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Later, just a few years later, Churchill, under Churchill's direction as in charge of a foreign ministry of the British, a section to the east of what is today the State of Israel, we call it Jordan, then Transjordan, is carved out, making the potential then future Jewish state actually much, much smaller. A thoughtful congregant wrote to me this week and lovingly corrected the way in which I somewhat downplayed, not so much an error of commission, but rather one of omission, the British mandatory governing doctrine, as well as its reinforcement through the League of Nations. So just reading a little bit here of material that I did not have that my friend Dave, our congregant, provided me. This actually comes from a couple of articles in the Mandate for Palestine. So this is the document that stipulated the way in which the British had committed to foster the development of a home for the Jewish people in the territory of Palestine. Article 2, the mandatory, meaning the British mandate, shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home as laid down in the preamble, and the development of self-governing institutions, and also for the safeguarding of the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. But again, a clearer declaration than perhaps I communicated to you last week of the declared British intention to establish a functioning home for the Jewish people in mandatory Palestine. Article 6. The administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions and shall encourage, in cooperation with the Jewish agency referred to in Article 4, close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. So, in other words, the British at this time, 1922, take a doctrinal stance actively encouraging Jewish immigration to the mandatory Palestine and pledge that they will secure all the necessary governing institutions, structures, and encouragement to allow the Jewish people to develop a home there. We spent quite some time talking about Arab resistance to Jewish settlement, or to the Yishuv, right? So when I use the word Yishuv, it just means the growing settlement of Jews, mostly by means of European immigration. But of course, now that a generation of Jewish settlement has been going on, we're also talking about just natural population growth. We also talked in our very first session about how mega financiers, especially Rothschild, were responsible for actually purchasing lands, particularly when it was still under Ottoman rule, to secure the establishment of dozens of Jewish villages and settlements in what is today the State of Israel. Arab resistance really begins in the 1920s, first with sporadic violence, and yes, usually with Jewish reprisal attacks. And really, if you want to talk about like the history of violent Arab resistance to Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael, which is just the biblical or the traditional Jewish term for the land of Israel, British Mandatory Palestine. It's not so much Eretz Yisrael is not a term of defined borders. It's actually a term of borders that change depending on where you are and when you are in Jewish history. Nevertheless, when we talk about Eretz Yisrael, we're talking about the land that will, or out of which will be formed the State of Israel, and today the Palestinian territories. When you're talking about Arab violent resistance to Jewish settlement, to the Yishuv, many historians look to 1929 as the kind of real flashpoint date. That we talked about last week is where a massacre of Jews by the hundreds in Hebron took place. And remember, we talked about how the Arab leaders demanded of the rabbi that they hand over all the Ashkenazi Jews, but they would let the Jews not of European extraction or not of Eastern European extraction live. Meanwhile, the Zionists continue all the more to immigrate to Eretz Yisrael and make efforts to develop the land. And this, of course, is the natural applied outgrowth of labor Zionism, that transformation of a doctrine that the real essence of Zionism was picking up implements of agriculture, draining swamps, planting fields, reducing the mortal threat of malaria. And the number of lives, by the way, not just Jewish, but Jewish and Arab, that were saved by these efforts is inestimable. The rise of the kibbutz movement, which are socialist agricultural collectives, which become really the backbone of Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael. We talked about how escalating violence between Arabs and Jews and Arab communities and Jewish villages led the British to form a commission in 1936, led by a guy named Peel. It is known as the Peel Commission. It was a 3-year effort to study the Arab-Jewish conflict in the mandate, in Mandatory Palestine, or in the Yishuv, and to make recommendations. The Peel Commission comes back and recommends favoring a partition of the land, with approximately 75% of the territory going to the Arabs, largely, but not exclusively, but largely drawing borders around where existing centers of population were already either established or growing, and about 25% of the territory going to the Jews. It was not smiled upon by the leaders of the Yishuv. They weren't happy with this arrangement, but the general consensus was better something than nothing. And you have to remember that 1936 to 1939, the situation in Europe is becoming very, very dire. This is already in the aftermath of the Nuremberg laws that effectively turned Jews into victims within the, non-citizens within the Reich. And of course, it would presage the war itself with Germany's attack on Poland in 1939, and the rest of the story we know, of course, the Holocaust. So Jews accept this deal. The Arabs walk away. They say, absolutely not. We will not partition this land. Then the Holocaust happens. And this whole while, by the way, at the beginning of the war, the British are, of course, preoccupied with the fact that the Germans are a direct existential threat to the United Kingdom. And of course, by 1940, London and Britain will be under Nazi siege from the Luftwaffe. The Brits compose a white paper, which is sort of like a public declaration of imperial policy. In this case, the white paper restricts Jewish immigration rather severely. And yet immigration continues, not only in compliance with the law, but especially in defiance of the British law, as the situation in Europe becomes much and much more dire. And we talked about the famous episode of the St. Louis carrying Jewish refugees from Europe only to find no safe harbor in Cuba, turning back, depositing its refugees with the heroism of its captain in various different countries that would take them in, but hundreds not making it to a safe place, and then returning to Nazi-occupied Europe, where most of them perished in the camps. We talked about, as the situation becomes more dire, the Zionists in Eretz Yisrael, in the Yishuv, are willing to take more extreme action to defend themselves. And so we see the rise of Yishuv militias that are more willing to use more extreme measures, including violence, to achieve their objectives. Many of the folks who organized and were active in the militias were influenced deeply by Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionist doctrine, some of which we read from his two famous essays of 1923 called The Iron Wall and Beyond the Iron Wall. And then, of course, I'm skimming, the extermination of 1 out of every 3 of the Jews left in Europe. And yet, even then, the Brits continue to turn away Jewish refugees even after the war. The most famous story is the story of the Exodus 1947, the vessel carrying 4,500 and more Jewish refugees that was blocked when they came into dock near Haifa. Of course, the British, not to defend them, simply to state the facts, were actually getting it from both ends. They were experiencing great difficulty managing the population that they had consented to not just govern, but help facilitate an eventual home, particularly for the Jews, and trying to manage now the Arab situation as well by proposing partition, which is rejected. They have difficulty managing the Arab-Jewish violence against each other, as well as increasingly aggressive violence by Jewish militias and Arab attacks against British command patrols, installations, what have you. So, the most famous examples of Jews who embrace these aggressive tactics, if you're not supportive of it, you would call it terrorism. If you are supportive of it, you might call it militantism. But the Irgun, or the organization, is noteworthy among them. You've probably heard this. And we talked about the Lehi, disparagingly sometimes called the Stern Gang, led by Avraham Stern, who was a revolutionary writer turned activist who really believed that, the Jews must accomplish their Zionist aims by any means necessary. And now we arrive at the War of Independence. And again, I'm going to try and summarize this as quickly as possible. The War of Independence, which is known in Hebrew as Milchemet HaAtzmaut, we call it Israel's War of Independence. The neutral term is sometimes referred to as the 1948 Palestine War, because again, the war begins before the declaration of independence of the State of Israel. The precipitating episode is what is known on the Jewish calendar, or the Israeli calendar, as Kaftet B'November, which means the 29th of November. Does anyone know what happened on the 29th of November, 1947? Really important date. Jim Glucksman. Well, it wasn't the UN partition. The UN actually, earlier that year, had proposed, I appreciate that you mentioned, that was actually the last point in my recap notes. In 1947, the United Nations, which is now a body that succeeded the League of Nations, but was only around for 2 years. The UN is really a response to World War II and an attempt to reshape the global order. And the UN recommends partition, again in 1947, with another map. This one, by the way, slightly more favorable to the Jews, who were now representing a larger share of the population of the territory. At this point, The Arabs again reject the UN partition plan. The Jews, the leadership of the Yeshuv, of the Zionist entity, says, yes, we'll take it. We'll take partition, but it is effectively scuttled because of Arab rejectionism. So Kaf Tepe November is actually the day, the 29th of November 1947 is the day that the UN approved the mandate for the State of Israel. So yes, it is considered a very important day. And when the Arabs walk away from the table, effectively that marks their resolve to fight this with violence, to fight the idea of a Jewish state that was being authorized by the United Nations. So the war actually has two phases. There's a civil war that takes place in late 1947 into the spring of 1948. It begins the day after the UN voted to adopt the partition plan. So, Jim, you had it exactly right, my bad, which would have divided the territory into two sovereign states, one for the Jews, one for the Arabs, with Jerusalem being an international city under UN Resolution number 181. The phase of the war that we're talking about from the 30th of November until right at the time of Israeli independence in May of 1948 is sometimes called a civil war. It's not civil in the sense of Jew on Jew. It is a civil war in that it is fought mainly between Jewish militias and Palestinian Arab militias who have support from the wider Arab sphere of influence, the Arab Liberation Army and the surrounding Arab states. The first month of this war, so we're talking really about December of 1947, is incredibly costly, with nearly 1,000 lives of Jewish Zionists being killed. And it was clear at that point that this was not going to be an easy fight. It was going to be a long, bloody war. The war was really characterized by guerrilla warfare and what we would call terrorism because, again, it was not principally waged by standing armies. The belligerents, as they were ragtag bands of militias or terror groups. It escalates by the end of March 1948, where the Jews are able to regroup and go on the offensive and conclude most of their major campaigns against the Palestinian Arabs by fighting battles and establishing clear front lines. During this period, by the way, the Brits are very much still the ruling power in this part of the world. So the mandate, British Mandatory Palestine, is still the proper name for the territory. And they are presiding over this incredibly bloody, incredibly chaotic war. And they occasionally attempted to intervene in the violence, usually, taking it on the chin when they did. So the British also were getting bloodied in the course of the War for Independence. It's also, I think, really important to understand that the War of Independence is or maybe the major starting point for divergent Arab narratives and Israeli narratives. Arabs in particular will seize on opportunities to portray Jewish militia attacks as, quote, massacres of their civilians, even when lacking evidentiary claims. One such episode takes place in late March and early April of 1948, just weeks before Israel decides to declare its independence. So here's what happened. The Arab forces had actually successfully cut off Jerusalem from all outside Jewish settlements. This is March 22nd, 1948. The Haganah, which is the name of the Israeli overarching military operation, defense forces, that will become the IDF pretty much as soon as Israel declares its independence. The Haganah effectively becomes the Israel Defense Forces. The Haganah was regrouping and trying to assemble its forces, preparing for a major invasion to set back Arab progress, which again had cut off Jerusalem, so Jerusalem was now isolated and vulnerable. With the more radical militias under the Haganah, meaning the Irgun and the Lehi, they decided, and again, one of the problems is this was not conducted by organized military strategy alone. You have a lot of independent military action that's happening on both sides, including the Jewish side. So the Irgun and the Lehi decide they're going to help the siege of Jerusalem by taking a town called Deir Yassin. which is an Arab village just west of Jerusalem, from which Arab forces were shooting down onto the main road in Jerusalem. So these more radical Jewish militias decide if they can take this town of Deir Yassin, this Arab town, it will provide relief and allow the Haganah to go back into Jerusalem and retake the city. On April 9th, so we're now 2.5, almost 3 weeks into this part of the war, the Haganah orders the Arab village of Deir Yassin to surrender. At the same time, fighters from the Irgun and the Lehi had infiltrated the village, and as they did, hoping and thinking they were going to have very little resistance, they found themselves very quickly outmatched by very strong Arab resistance in Deir Yassin. What happened next is very much a matter of dispute and controversy. But what is probably best understood is that the Jewish fighters from these more radical militias found themselves pinned down inside of Deir Yassin, panicked, and may have thrown grenades into homes in order to cause as much destruction as they can, and also probably to try and save their own skins. As a result, a lot of civilian lives were lost in Deir Yassin. How many? The Irgun itself actually reported about 100 civilian deaths. A figure that, by the way, is later independently verified to be accurate. But the early accounts, mostly promulgated by the Arab populace, accuse the Jews of massacring as many as 250 villagers and raping them as well. And so what happened was, and again, it has been substantiated that some of the early reports were falsified reports. Nevertheless, you can kind of see echoes of even what's happening today, that wars are fought not just with guns and bombs and soldiers and tanks and planes. Wars are also fought with words and images, and they are fought for minds and hearts and not just casualties recorded in numbers of bodies. And I think that's something just to observe that, you know, this is war, by the way. And this is modern warfare. The British are really in over their heads at this point. And although they had been gradually planning to do this, they finally terminate the mandate at midnight on the 14th of May, 1948. And on that day, the last British troops and personnel depart the city of Haifa, and the Jewish leadership in British Mandatory Palestine under Ben-Gurion in a 40-minute ceremony at what is today Independence Hall in Tel Aviv. How many have visited? Been there, right? It was actually an art museum that had been the home of Mayor Dizengoff, who Mayor Dizengoff was the mayor of Tel Aviv and a legendary figure in early Zionist history. Dizengoff Street is named for him. So in a short ceremony concluding with the singing of Hatikva, which had been the Zionist national anthem, Ben-Gurion declares the state of Israel. If you were with us on the second day of Rosh Hashanah this year, we did kind of a deep dive into the actual text of the Declaration of the State of Israel, which is called, in common parlance, Megillat Yisrael. It's a Megillah, meaning a scroll, just like a sacred scroll of Esther or Ecclesiastes or any of the other traditional Jewish texts from the Tanakh. It is, I think, one of the most beautiful, meaningful, and important documents in all of Jewish history. We just don't have time to do it today because we're going to keep our focus on the conflict. So now, Israel, and Ben-Gurion knew the risks here. He knew that this could create an opportunity, which it does immediately, for a massive escalation of the hostilities, and that the Palestinian Arabs, who had been fighting against the Jews in a guerrilla war since the 30th of November, would now have allies throughout the Arab world to actually escalate the hostilities, which is exactly what happened. But Ben-Gurion and the leadership said, basically, it's now or never. We must do this now. We must declare the state, come what may. And that's exactly what happened. So this is where we mark the second phase of the war, which is properly known as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. It's all part of the Israel War for Independence, but the first part is an internecine conflict between Palestinian Arabs, principally with a little bit of support from the outside, and the Jews, and the British, who were, again, the governing power at the time, and part of the efforts is to shake off the yoke of the Brits at the same time that the Jews are fighting the Arabs. What happens immediately after independence is the Egyptians advance en masse on the southern coastal strip and were halted near Ashdod, which is not too far from Gaza. Simultaneously, the Jordanian Legion, the Jordanian Arab Legion, joined by Iraqi forces. The Iraqis and the Jordanians, those are adjacent states and often in league together. The Iraqis and the Jordanians capture the central highlands of what is, now Israel, but also what they thought of as Palestine. Syria and Lebanon, joining together, fought several skirmishes with Israeli forces in the north. Jewish militias, now organized collectively as the IDF, managed to halt all of the Arab forces over the course of several months, which saw fierce fighting back and forth between the IDF and the Arab armies, which, although there's kind of, gains and losses, the overall trend is that the Arab armies are slowly being pushed back. There are some critical moments in this war, and again, I only highlight these not because I want to emphasize that they are more important than any other parts of the war, but if you're looking at what we're seeing today and trying to make sense of why is this happening, why is the news what the news is, why are sympathies turned this way or that way, I think that episodes like this are helpful because they point to the way in which what I describe as the diverging Arab and Israeli narratives, or the diverging Palestinian and Israeli narratives, are equally, if not more important than the body count in bloody conflict. So one of the most controversial moments, and again, please don't hear me as trying to emphasize that the controversies are what it's all about, but they are illuminating for understanding almost like the conflict from a psychosocial standpoint and not just a military history standpoint. One of the most controversial episodes happened in the then mostly Arab city of Lydda, L-Y-D-D-A, in the summer of 1948, and the war is still raging. Jerusalem at this point, by the way, is barely hanging on by a thread. And Ben-Gurion is determined to open another road to the city since the others had been cut off by Arab forces in order to defend Jerusalem from the encroaching Jordanians who, remember, had teamed up with the Iraqis. And so Ben-Gurion and his top military brass decide that it needs to capture the Arab town of Lydda, which is, by the way, where Ben-Gurion Airport is today. Today it is called, in Hebrew, Lod. Lod, it's really right between, halfway between on the latitude between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. At the time, 20,000 or so Arabs were inhabiting the city, a population that had actually swelled when Arabs fled other towns during the fighting. We'll talk about Arabs fleeing and other reasons for population displacement in a moment. So now it's July 1948. And on July 11th, during a battle for the city of Lydda, the IDF takes over two important structures in Lydda, the Great Mosque and the Church of St. George, and orders the population to report to those two buildings, to the point where both structures, both the mosque and the church, are overflowing with human beings. According to most accounts, the IDF then soon softened its order and allowed and actually ordered women and children to leave. A stalemate between IDF forces and Arab forces in the city continued, with lots of fire, including sniper fire, from local buildings shooting down onto IDF forces from another smaller mosque. The IDF receives an order from the top to put down the Arab fire, like end this conflict. And in the ensuing battle, it is believed that IDF forces fired an anti-tank grenade at the mosque directly, which caused many casualties. How many? We don't know. And to this day, historians, and when I say historians disagree, I don't just mean Jewish historians and Arab historians. I mean Israeli historians within Israel today disagree. You have a traditional Israeli history camp of historians, scholars, who believe that this was a legitimate act of war conducted in the interest of saving IDF soldiers from sniper fire and defending the city, and defending themselves so that they could take the city. Revisionist Israeli historians have taken a much more sharply critical look at this and other episodes. And again, these debates rage today. You might think of them as left and right. The more liberal historians in Israel have gone so far as to call what happened in Lida a massacre. There are other Jewish historians in Israel who strenuously reject that categorization. Danny Gordis, in the book that I've recommended everyone reads, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, takes, I think, a very fair and balanced view, and he basically says, look, historians don't really know, but they disagree. Ari Shavit, Avi Shavit? Ari Shavit, in My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel, which I think came out in 2012 or 2013, takes a very critical view of what happened in Lida. And it's one of the reasons that some people, particularly on the right of center or the right in Israel, really panned the book, and other people on the left love the book because they think that it took an honest look at what happened in war. You know, again, I don't have the answers. I wasn't there. I am merely saying that if you want to understand that Al-Shifa Hospital is not the first time we've had to ask really hard questions about what's really going on here. How many of these are legitimate military targets? How many of these are civilians? That's, of course, we're not talking about human shields. What is known is that the IDF told people to go into these buildings before they fired on the mosque. So to this day, we don't know, but from the standpoint of divergent narratives, these differences widen the gap between how Israelis understand their origin and how Palestinians understand their origin as a nation. The Jordanian and Iraqi armies nevertheless managed to gain control over most of the central highlands of Palestine. So this effort is really not successful, and they capture all of East Jerusalem, including the old city of Jerusalem. So most of you probably are aware of this, that following the War of Independence, Jerusalem remains a divided city, and the territory that we call the West Bank today, that is, you know, Palestinian territory, disputed territory, we have all sorts of other words for talking about it, it's actually by the end of the war under Jordanian control. Egyptians' zone of occupation, Egyptians encroach into Israel as far as to include the Gaza Strip and a small pocket surrounded by Israeli forces at a place called Al-Fallujah. In October and December, so we're already now almost a year into the war of 1948, Israeli forces cross into Lebanon and push also on the northern front, they push into Egypt's Sinai. They encircle the Egyptian forces near Gaza City, and the last military activity goes all the way until March of 1949, when Israeli forces, again, now strengthened and being able to regroup, capture the Negev Desert, which is the southern part of Israel, and reach as far south as the Red Sea. In 1949, Israel signs separate armistice treaties with Egypt, so that's the 24th of February, 49, with Lebanon on the 23rd of March, with what is then called Transjordan, later Jordan, on the 3rd of April, and with Syria not until the 20th of July. And during this period, what's happening to the Palestinian Arabs? This is, again, another one of the most disputed, controversial, and it's really a war of words, even more than we're talking about a war of bodies. What we know is that by the end of the war, about 700,000 Palestinian Arabs who had lived in British Mandatory Palestine, some had lived in this territory for generations or even centuries before. By the way, some Jews were living in this territory for centuries before, though not nearly as many as Arabs had been living there. About 700,000 Palestinian Arabs are now displaced, and many of their urban areas were destroyed, uninhabitable, in very, very bad shape. These Palestinian Arabs do end up, in a sense, stateless, because they are living now variously either in Palestinian territories that are captured by Egypt and Jordan, or some of them flee to surrounding Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, and many of them, including their descendants, including to the present day, identify themselves as stateless refugees, with many of them still living in refugee camps. If you want to jump to 2023, it is reasonable to ask, how come there are still refugees living in refugee camps in 2023 when the displacement of these Arabs, and when I say displacement, that's not a fair term either, because it includes several reasons why Palestinian Arabs were displaced. Some fled when the IDF came. Some were ordered to evacuate by the IDF. Many were actually ordered to leave by their own Arab leaders, both locally and for larger Arab bodies. They said, get out. Some Arab leaders promised, we'll be back, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, I'll be back, said, don't worry, you can evacuate now, but we will resist the Zionists and we will prevail, and you'll go back to your homes in what is today the state of Israel. This is in large measure, this is entirely why Palestinians and their leadership have continued to demand a so-called right of return for Palestinians to return, not to return to places like the West Bank or Gaza, where the vast majority of the Palestinians in Eretz Yisrael now live, but rather to return to their homes in places like Western Jerusalem and all of the towns that are sovereign Israel, which is a term of negotiation in every single peace talk that has come up and that Israel has not entertained in any serious way. A serious Palestinian right of return to sovereign Israel, from simply a demographic standpoint, would cut entirely against the Jewish character of the world's only Jewish state. That's a logical argument that Israel has made. Nevertheless, this has been one of the grinding friction points in the conflict that has never been resolved. So you have Palestinians, again, about 700,000, who now are displaced. They either left of their own free will, they left in fear, they were evacuated out by the IDF, or they were told to leave by their own leaders. And nobody knows the exact numbers. People still are arguing over this to this very day. Also, not irrelevant, in the years following the war, about 800,000 Jews are expelled from Arab lands and emigrate to Israel. So Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Egypt, all expel their Jews variously over the next 10 to 15 years. Some leave in violent pogroms, have already left, by the way, like the Farhud, which is a very deadly pogrom killing hundreds and hundreds of Jews in Baghdad in 1941. So, this is part of the conflict, right? You have Jews who emigrated to Israel. Israel, under the law of return, which is one of the core doctrines of the Jewish state, which is that anyone who has even one Jewish grandparent is eligible for repatriating Israel or for becoming a citizen of Israel under the law of return. Why one grandparent? Because it was the same metric used by Hitler to determine who could be consigned to death for being Jewish. So in other words, the Jewish state takes the most expansive position in terms of who is a Jew, almost as a way of acknowledging and overturning the Nazi doctrine of we will murder anyone who is a Jew, even if they don't think of themselves as a Jew because they had one Jewish grandparent. It's really interesting. And the law of return to this day still applies the same standard, but was one of the flashpoint arguments last year in Israel in the democracy protest movement, that the extreme right elements of the Netanyahu governing coalition, some of them wanted to reconsider the law of return to make it more restrictive, so that you have to have a more identifiably Jewish origin than just one grandparent. Okay. Questions up till here. Just up till this period. We're only in 1949. Yes? Exactly. It's a puppet state. It's a minority that was installed basically to govern in Jordan. Right. Ethnically, Jordanians are largely, about 3/4, Palestinian. That's where they come from. And remember that Jordan actually is the ruling power in what today is the West Bank, which includes half of Jerusalem, includes all of East Jerusalem from the time the war ends in 1949 until the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. I don't know enough to comment with authority on the stories in all of these different countries, but if you know a little bit about your history, the 1940s and the 1950s were a time of great upheaval in countries that had been colonized by European empires. Britain, France, Portugal, etc. You see this throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And so if you want to watch one movie that's incredible, I think it was, I don't know when it was made, probably in the 60s, but there's a movie called The Battle of Algiers. It is one of the most riveting films you will ever watch. It's awesome. It's a fiction, but it's historical fiction. It is just searing story of Algerians uprising against the French colonial power. So I don't know enough. You know the British had to let go of India in 1947, and Britain gives up lots of territory during this period, but I don't know exactly when the Hashemites are installed. Was it, you said 46? That sounds right to me, but trust but verify, so we'll check. Thank you. Yeah, Don. I don't know that for sure, by the way. Because don't forget, Jews had been living in this territory and emigrating in by tens. So before the war, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the state. Ben-Gurion and the top leadership of the Yishuv in part felt that they could declare independence in May of 1948 because at that point, the Jewish population of the Mandate was about 600,000, barely enough on most metrics to create a viable state with viable infrastructure. So I don't know enough about the demography to verify or discount that comment. That's for sure. That's for sure. Like again, there's a kind of a slapdash quality to a lot of this, and the fact that Israel was able to prevail over all of these forces arrayed against them, mightier than they, is a true modern Hanukkah story, right? And we're going to see that with our Hanukkah lights almost ready to be lit on the lawn behind us. Okay, I'm going to continue, and we'll take a few more as we go, but I'm really mindful of my objectives versus time. Following the war, the next section of my notes is called Israel Establishes Itself as a True Military Power. Having said that, contrary to what you might think, that, okay, Israel has definitively won the Arab-Israeli War, or the War of Independence, this two-phase conflict that lasted, 18 months, I think, 18 or 19 months. That would have ceased hostilities. Quite the opposite. That is not true at all. Following the war, regular incessant attacks were carried out against Israel, mostly by Palestinian Arabs living under Jordanian or Egyptian authority. All right, so I'm going to now start transitioning into calling these people the Palestinians. All right, what I mean are the Palestinian Arabs who had been living under British Mandatory Palestine, many, if not most, tracing their roots to the Ottoman period, which was centuries long in some cases, and their descendants, now mostly living in what is Jordanian or Egyptian authority. Many Palestinians are now sneaking over the border to carry out unprovoked attacks on Israeli villages, Israeli towns, Israeli civilians, Israeli targets, right? And military targets as well. Pretty much from the moment the war ends, one of the most atrocious attacks is still taught in Israeli schools. Everyone knows about it. It was the murder of an entire Israeli family by Palestinian Arabs who infiltrated Israel in 1953. The IDF, meanwhile, realizes that in order to make sure that Israel cannot be vanquished, it must become a leading fighting force at the top level in the world, right? It just has to make itself into the military envy of the region. And so the IDF, again, formerly the Haganah, creates an elite unit of fighters called Unit 101. Many of these fighters are volunteers, not conscripts. Choice volunteers who are in peak physical condition and ready for the mental challenges of serving in unbelievable circumstances. Many had served in the elite unit of the Haganah before independence, which was known as the Palmach. Some of these terms may be familiar to you. And they operate under the command of a young Israeli military commander named Ariel Sharon, which may be a name you've heard. In 1953, Unit 101 carries out a reprisal attack for the murder of this family, surnamed Kanias. So the Kanias family, which had been murdered entirely by Palestinian infiltrators, raided the West Bank village of Kibbia and killed as many as 50 or 60 villagers. These reprisal attacks by the IDF, by their elite forces, were intentionally brutal in order to send a message that the IDF was not going to tolerate attacks on its civilians. And the biggest proponent of very, very strong reprisal attacks by the IDF is the chief of command, a fellow you know, think about the eye patch, Moshe Dayan. This reprisal attack leads to widespread condemnation of Israel, even from America. And by the way, this is the same year that an organization of American Jewish activists form a coalition in order to make sure that Israel's allyship with the United States remains strong. That's AIPAC. AIPAC does not really become an influential player until the 1970s, by the way. And I think that by people who are opponents of Israel, opponents of AIPAC, is often portrayed in a very negative light. It's actually just a small, grassrootsy political action group that gains in strength over the decades. But in part, it was because the U.S. support for Israel was not guaranteed. It is true that Truman was the first to recognize Israel after the UN's partition plan was, sent out on the 29th of November. America said yes, right? We were the first yes vote. Truman had to be pushed into that kicking and screaming. He really didn't want much to do with Israel after World War II. But his buddy Eddie Jacobson basically twisted his arm and said, you've got to meet this guy. His name is Chaim Weizmann. And he was basically the chief spokesperson, statesman for Israel at the time. So in order to shore up American support, AIPAC is formed. But Ben-Gurion, nevertheless, is totally unmoved by the fact that everyone condemns these reprisal attacks. And the IDF develops a reputation for being a formidable foe. Okay, 1952. A new Pharaoh, I'm thinking of the line from the book of Exodus, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. In this case, a coup led by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, so a military coup led by Nasser, ousts the monarch of Egypt, King Farouk. Nasser comes to power and decides that he is going to restore Egypt to its ancient glory. And remember, Egypt was beaten and badly humiliated in the 1948 war, 1948-1949 war. He promotes a message that not only is he going to restore Egypt to its former glory, he's going to unite Arabs from all over the Arab world. And he decides that as the linchpin of his strategy to build a high dam in Aswan on the Nile, which was going to allow Egypt to attain economic prosperity and independence from the rest of the larger spheres of influence by the Soviets and the US and Britain, France, etc. He actually appeals to the Soviets to help fund the project, in addition to receiving funding from the West. So he was taking it from wherever he could get it. By approaching the Soviets, it was interpreted that this was an act of belligerence by Western Europe and by the US. So Britain, France, the US don't like this at all because remember, it's the Cold War now, right? It's the start of the Cold War. He also starts massively rearming his country, having been defeated by Israel in 1948 and 49. Again, with Soviet assistance, though, it was through the puppet state of what was then Czechoslovakia. So the Czechoslovakians were giving arms to Egypt, but it was really just under the direction of the USSR. The US decides it's withdrawing support for this dam project. It wants nothing to do with it. It's not going to collaborate with the Soviets. So in order to fund the dam, Nasser comes up with this bold new strategy. In 1956, in the summer, he announces, to everyone's astonishment, he's going to nationalize the Suez Canal, which had been a major international waterway for almost 100 years since its opening in 1969. This, of course, enrages the West, Britain and France in particular, who were using this for their shipping corridors. It also alarms Israel, which now begins to see Egypt as yet again an imminent threat only 7 years after the conclusion of the last war. Secretly, at the same time, Israel had been meeting for the better part of the year with the French to discuss the Egyptian threat and agreed by October 1956 that Israel was going to launch an attack against Nasser's forces in an attempt to try to reach the Suez Canal in a single day, at which point the British and French would call on both countries to cease fire, cease all hostilities, and demand that Egypt open the canal to international shipping. The whole thing was a ruse, by the way. And what else is Israel doing with France at this time? Does anyone know? Yes, right, they're rearming with their Air Force, and right. They are preparing a secret nuclear reactor in Dimona in the Negev, in southern part of Israel. We'll get to that in a minute. On October 29th, 1956, again, just 8 years, shy 1 month after the start of the War of Independence, Israeli forces move en masse into the Sinai Desert, which is Egyptian. Paratroopers under the command, again, of Ariel Sharon, make their way toward the Suez Canal, and they overtake 3 Egyptian military bases in a single day, October 30th. That same day, Britain, according as per its promise, issues their public ultimatum. Remember, they had secretly organized this with Israel. We're going to condemn this and insist that Egypt open the canal to international shipping and withdraw and stop hostilities. Egypt refuses and keeps control of the canal, and therefore the Israelis refuse to stop advancing. So Israelis keep marching toward the Suez. The next day, British and French fighter jets bomb Egyptian airfields. They never put boots on the ground in this war. This is the Sinai War at this point, 1956. The Israelis still refusing to back down. They refused to retreat from the Sinai. They had captured the entire Sinai Desert in less than 100 hours, which astounded the world at the time. You have to understand that this was the first time since the War of Independence where it really was this very ragtag, as Don said, this kind of like, hastily assembled forces fighting this war. All of a sudden, 8 years later, they have a world-class elite military. Israel understandably doesn't want to withdraw from the Sinai even after capturing most of the important Egyptian military targets, because it is afraid that the Sinai and Gaza could be used as launching grounds for new attacks against Israel. Again, presaging some of the things we're thinking about today. Israel asks the U.S. to guarantee safe retreat of its forces back to Israel and to guarantee Israel's freedom to act in self-defense in the future. And that's how Israel is able to make a safe exit from this belligerence. And in return for being so strong and so proactive, Israel gains a decade of quiet in its willingness to stand up to Nasser. So this is really important for understanding. You can't really understand one next war without understanding the one that came before it. Like, most of us are much more familiar with what happened in 67 and 73. You can't understand 73 without understanding 67. You can't understand 67 without understanding 56. And you can't understand 56 without understanding the War of Independence. It's all connected. So this Sinai campaign had lasted only 9 days, from October 29th to November 7th. But it marked Israel as a major player, militarily speaking, on the world stage. And, by the way, it marked it as a major political force whose actions were consequential not just for the Middle East, but for the US, for Britain, for France, and for the Soviet Union. So often what's happening in Israel is actually about something much larger that's happening, including today, by the way. I've met with Israeli top military brass who say, if you're thinking about what's happening in the Middle East as a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, you have it all wrong. The actual conflict is between Sunni Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, the Saudis, and Shia Arabs, the Shiites, represented by Iran. And that is the massive geopolitical conflict. And what's happening in Israel is often just a proxy. The same way what's happening in Lebanon is a proxy for Iran, Syria is a proxy for Iran, what's happening in Yemen is a proxy for what's happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Israel, largely because of where it is and what it is trapped in between and is often propagandized as the cause of the conflict, when in fact, it's not incidental to the conflict. I think that overstates the case, or understates the case as it may be. But it is not actually the root of the conflict happening in the Arab Middle East. It is part of it, but it makes a very convenient message, a narrative, a propaganda point, to blame the Jewish state for all the violence and problems in the Middle East. Right? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being fanned by the Arab Middle East as part of the larger conflict between Shia and Sunni spheres of influence. I'm going to skip to 1967. By 1967, once again, tensions had been building up in the region for some time. I'll just sort of quickly go down things that had happened in the decade. So Nasser, remember, is forced to stand down. Israel has demonstrated itself as a force you don't monkey with. And in the meantime, between 1956 and 1966, it is secretly collaborating with the French to develop nuclear power and nuclear arms. How many? We don't know. Maybe 80 to 400 nuclear weapons in Israel's arsenal today. It is still a kind of open secret that Israel is a nuclear power, which, of course, Ben-Gurion aggressively pursued this. Ben-Gurion is a fascinating figure with an extraordinary sense of timing, but he does lean toward autocratic tendencies. And he muscled his way through things that created fallout. If you want to, again, I don't want to do too much on the domestic stuff, which is what I really think is just fascinating. Okay. So in the decade between the Sinai War and the 67 War, you have all sorts of stuff popping up on Israel's borders. In the north, Syria decides that it's going to divert water away from Israel's national water carrier by as much as like a third of the water supply. And Israel says this will be an act of war. Syria is unmoved by that and continues to do it. And so what you have is in the north, in the Golan, Syria is firing on Israeli villages, and Israelis are firing on the equipment that the Syrians are using, the heavy earth-moving equipment, in order to build their waterway and divert essential resources away from Israel. Meanwhile, because this is happening, so you've got all of this skirmishing in the Golan, the Soviet Union decides to send out a lot of propaganda that, without evidence, that Israel is moving troops into the north. The US, by the way, speaks up and says, no, they're not. Absolutely total lie. But the point is that now you see what's happening in Israel, in the Middle East, is actually about what's happening between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Meanwhile, Nasser hasn't gone anywhere, and he's becoming increasingly belligerent. And by May 15th, 1967, on the day that Israelis were celebrating their 19th year of independence, Nasser publicly makes a speech where he says, "The time has come to prepare for the final battle in Palestine." What was this? Why was he choosing now? Why was he choosing this message? Was it just about restoring Arab pride? Many think so. Remember, Nasser, in addition to wanting to restore Egyptian glory, had long campaigned and long shored up his own power by saying, I am not just the ruler of Egypt, I am the ruler of the entire Arab world. That is sort of how Nasser, he really viewed himself as a modern-day incarnation of the pharaoh, of the great pharaohs of Egypt. We have kind of like a squeamish reaction whenever somebody describes someone as a pharaoh. If you're Egyptian, it's good to be the pharaoh, right? Okay. So Israel smartly decides, you know what? We don't know if he's bluffing or if this is just like saber rattling, chest thumping. We're going to take him at his word. When the president of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, says, we're preparing for the final battle in Palestine, that got the attention of Israel. Not long after, Egyptian forces were streaming into the Sinai, and Nasser instructs the UN to remove UN troops from the region, which the secretary of the UN, a guy named Utant, did without even blinking. He didn't even inform the General Assembly. He's like, okay, I guess we'll go. So now the Sinai has Egypt closing in on Israel's southern border. Egypt is approaching the southern border, and the UN peacekeeping forces are all gone. On May 26th, just 11 days later, Nasser again gives a speech where he says, we are going to destroy Israel. Protests erupt throughout the Arab world. What were the protesters saying? Death to the Jews. Right? He was getting the entire Arab world riled up against Israel. Meanwhile, Israel is on this kind of like throw everything at the wall diplomatic effort across the world with its number one statesman, incredible guy named Abba Eban. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Just one of the most eloquent and compelling, charismatic figures in all of history, including Israeli history. So Israel is going to try and do like this diplomatic juggernaut against an Egyptian onslaught. It's also, by the way, this is really interesting, pursuing private secret diplomacy with Jordan. For 19 years, Israel and Jordan, remember, had been a belligerent twice. It had fought against Israel in the War of Independence. It also fought against Israel in the Sinai campaign. But for most of the last 19 years, the Jordanians and the Israelis have kind of had like a cold stalemate. And King Hussein of Jordan, although meeting with the Israelis, basically says, I can't really help you here, because he had already accepted an invitation to go to Cairo with Nasser, and he felt extremely pressured by Nasser to join the war. Remember, Nasser, pan-Arabism, is like, we're going to get the whole Arab world to put an end to this Israeli Zionist encroaching entity in Palestine. Syria also teams up with the Jordanians. So now you've got an axis of Syria, Jordan, and mostly Egypt. And of course, the Iraqis decide to join in. So they start sending troops to Egypt again, the same way they did in 1948. Israel is now facing a war on three fronts. Right? It's late May 1967. We've got Syria in the north, Iraq helping the Jordanians, who are to the west, to the east rather, and Egypt to the south, with Iraq supporting it. All right, we know what happens next, right? So what did Israel do? Exactly. 5th of June, so just another 9 days later, just as the UN expeditionary forces are leaving the Sinai, Israel launches a series of preemptive airstrikes against all Egyptian airfields, basically wiping out all of Egypt's military assets and giving Israel complete air supremacy in the next 5 days. Simultaneously, Israel launches a ground offensive against Egypt in the Sinai and into Gaza, which is controlled by Egypt at the time. After some initial resistance, Nasser orders the Sinai to be evacuated. By the 6th day of the conflict, Israel has occupied the entire Sinai Peninsula. Jordan, which, as you know, had decided to enter into a mutual defense pact with Egypt only days before the war broke out, did not take an all-out offensive role against Israel. They launched attacks against Israel to slow its advance. On the 5th day, Syria joins the war in the north by shelling Israeli positions in the Golan. There's a ceasefire declared on the 8th of June, and with Egypt. By the 9th of June, there's a ceasefire with Syria. It was signed with Israel on the 11th of June. In the course of 6 days, more than 20,000 Arabs had died. Israel suffered fewer than 1,000 fatalities. Alongside the combatants who died, 20 Israeli civilians were killed in Arab forces when they were the wider Arab world airstrikes on Jerusalem. 15 UN peacekeepers were killed by Israeli strikes in the Sinai, and 34 United States personnel were killed in the U.S. Liberty, in which the IDF accidentally struck a U.S. Navy technical research ship. By the end of the war, I think most of you know this, Israel had captured the Golan Heights in the north, the West Bank in the east, and Gaza and the Sinai in the south. Nasser resigns in shame. He's actually later reinstated, which is fascinating, following a series of protests across Egypt. In the aftermath of the conflict, Egypt actually closes the Suez Canal as an act of belligerent protest, which precipitates the energy crisis in the 1970s. How many of you remember that? I don't. I was getting born. Okay. Right. All right. We're doing pretty well here. So that's what happens in the 6-day war. Again, I'm interested in war, but I'm also interested in national psychology. And I think what happens in Israel following the 6-day war is one of the most important things to understand about Israeli collective psychology and identity. So Gordis uses this word that Israelis themselves use, which is the conceptia, or the self-conception. How Israelis came to view themselves after this war. You can imagine that after the stunning victory in the Sinai in the 50s, and now the 6-day war, even more stunning, that Israel was seized not just with national pride, but with a fervor that bordered on the messianic, particularly among the more nationalistically extreme and religiously extreme elements of its population, the Jewish population, of course. This could only be a miracle. This could only be the coming of the Messiah, that we, the little David, have defeated Goliath. The Maccabees have defeated Antiochus. And when it's layered with Jewish history, which is never really about history, Jewish history is about collective memory, right? How many times have you had a Passover Seder where you're reading the Haggadah? It says we must see ourselves as if we went out of Egypt, because we're not here to tell a history story. We're here to tell our story, narrative, right? I was an English major. I love history, but I'm more interested in narrative and the way in which narrative shapes identity. And the narrative is the history. So when people say to me, there is no such thing as the Palestinian people, I might say, well, are you talking about history? Are you talking about story? The story that Palestinians have been telling themselves for at least the last 60 years is that they are a people, that they are a nation without a state. You can say that the history doesn't back that up. It doesn't matter. Really, I'm leaving that as an open question. And today, this debate rages, and it tears apart the Jewish people, by the way. But as a person who really, my main, my bailiwick is storytelling. That's how I see myself. It's how I view the conflict. It's the stories we tell. And by the way, I think that's a really relevant lens through which to understand what's happening today. Not just what's happening in Gaza, it's the stories that are being told about what's happening in Gaza. Some of those stories are poisoning minds and hearts. Okay, we'll get to most of that next week. Halavai, God willing. The war that nobody remembers is called the War of Attrition. Basically, with Nasser still in power, Nasser was resigned but then reinstated. Egypt actually engages in serious skirmishes around the Suez with Israel following the 67 war. You would think that they were so badly beaten, we're just like, we're going to lay down our arms and not mess with the Israelis. That's not actually what happens. There are limited artillery duels and small-scale incursions into Sinai for the better part of 3 years. And in 1969, the Egyptian army says, you know what? I think we can conduct some larger-scale operations. So on March 8th, Nasser proclaims an official launch of what he called the War of Attrition. In other words, if we can't defeat them in a large-scale invasion, we'll grind them down. We'll grind them down with our forces. So there's shelling along the Suez Canal, there's aerial warfare and commando raids, all with the intent of getting the Israelis out of Sinai. Hostilities actually continue until August of 1970 when there's a ceasefire. Now we have to kind of detour. And I didn't know if we'd make it to the Yom Kippur War today, and I suspect we won't, but that's okay. I put it like a little red line on my notes saying, Yom Kippur War next week. Yeah, okay, but that's fine. It's 1 o'clock. We'll do Yom Kippur War to the present day. 50 years, exactly. So we got a 50-year time. That's a very ambitious timeline. So next week we have to cover Yom Kippur War, Lebanon in 82, the Intifadas, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and the, okay, well, I don't want to spoil all of it. It's good stuff next week. Okay, come back. Okay. Spoilers, right. I love spoilers. You have to have a reason to come back. Okay. The year is 1929. In Hebron, Arabs have carried out a devastating attack on the Jews of the city. The Hebron massacre, what we think of as a massacre, right? The same year, a man is born in Cairo to a father who comes from Gaza City and a mother who comes from Jerusalem. They are Arabs who trace their ancestry. Their family comes from Palestine, under the Ottomans, and then under the British. So now it's, 11 years after the end of World War I. This man's name is Yasser Arafat. In the War of Independence, or what he would have thought of as the Palestinian-Israeli War, Arafat, then 19 years old, fought alongside a group called the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an extremist Islamist organization dedicated to waging war against the infidel. By the way, the current military dictatorship in Egypt, led by al-Sisi, is very strongly opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood continues to exist today. It was born out of an attempt to unite Arab peoples under the banner of a fairly strict interpretation of Islam and to use violence to defend that principle. And according to al-Sisi, Hamas is nothing other than the Muslim Brotherhood operating in Gaza. Right? So the Muslim Brotherhood is rightly categorized in the same bucket of different militias and organizations that all subscribe to highly overlapping Islamist doctrines, violent jihadist doctrines that include names with which we are now very familiar through painful experience, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Boko Haram in Africa and what have you, and the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, all violent Islamist organizations. So Arafat, with the Muslim Brotherhood, fights the Israelis, fights the Zionists in 1948, 1949. After the Sinai War in 1956, all of these Muslim militants are expelled from Israel. This is interesting. This is one of the things that Israel did after the war. It's like, we've had it with Arab extremism, and they get rid of the Fedayeen, who are the Muslim militants in Israel. At that point, Arafat moves to Kuwait, where he lives in a community of exiled Palestinian refugees and founds an organization called Fatah, which is the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. This is in the late 50s. Later, a decade later, in the late 60s, in 1967, Fatah will be absorbed into what is called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO was founded in 1964 at a summit of the Arab League, which is a kind of conglomerate or constellation of various representatives from the various Arab nations of the Middle East. At this meeting in Cairo in '64, the Arab League initiates the creation of an organization whose intention is, we need an organization to represent the interests of the Palestinian people. Right? It's 1964. So it's 15 years after the end of the War of Independence. A Palestinian National Council is convened in Jerusalem that same year, and after concluding this meeting, they found the organization called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, on the 2nd of June, 1964. It says we have two goals. One, Arab unity, and two, the, quote, liberation of Palestine. And I'm going to read from the charter of the PLO. Zionism is a colonialist movement in its inception, aggressive and expansionist in its goals, racist and segregationist in its configurations, and fascist in its means and aims. Israel in this capacity as the spearhead of this destructive movement and the pillar for colonialism is a permanent source of tension and turmoil in the Middle East in particular and to the international community in general. So the PLO is founded on the principle of Zionism is colonialism, Zionism is a destructive and fascist force, and it is bad for the Middle East and it's bad for the world. And by the way, combine that with its two stated objectives, which are to, quote, liberate the Palestinian people, as well as to generate Arab unity. That's exactly what they do. So again, whether you think of it as history or story, I believe that it is fair to talk about the origin of the Palestinian people as a nation without a state, or as a people, forget about nation, which is more controversial, to 1964. That's when they are officially organized under a body with stated aims, right? A movement. Well, you can imagine 3 years later, 1967 is a humiliating defeat for the PLO, right? Because it shows that now the Jews are in control of the West Bank, the Golan, Gaza, and the Sinai. The Palestinians are now living as this entity that sees itself as a people with national aspirations, but they're living in areas that are controlled variously by Israel in the West Bank, formerly Jordanian. So yes, are they Palestinian or are they Jordanian? Well, Jordan had been governing the West Bank since the War of Independence. Now Israel is in charge. Aggravating tensions. At the same time, the swift and unthinkable victory of Israel brings about a nationalistic fervor in the Jewish state that, as I said before, borders on the messianic, at least in some quarters of the Jewish state. The story of an organization called Gush Emunim illustrates what's happening in Israel. It is not a majority of Israelis who support Gush Emunim, but the fact that Gush Emunim can happen post-67 is a sign of the times. So Gush Emunim, which means the Block of the Faithful, BLOC, is a nationalist, mostly Orthodox Jewish organization, a movement committed to establishing Jewish settlement in the reclaimed, that's what they would say, Jewish lands of Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. Again, believing that when Israel prevailed in the War of '67, it didn't occupy a foreign nation. It won back lands that at least a significant part of the Israeli population believed were rightly Israeli to begin with. Differing narratives here. They decide that the way we can really make sure that these claims are permanentized, made permanent, is by putting people in these territories. And so they promote a movement of Jewish settlement into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. And while not formally established as an organization, actually until after the Yom Kippur War, Gush Emunim is a movement that really is gaining steam post-67. For those followers of this movement specifically, they were motivated by a distinctly religious point of view. They really believe that according to the Torah, God wants the Jewish people to live in the land of Israel, in all of the land of Israel, and that the fact that we had returned these lands or let Jordan govern them following the War of Independence was an aberration in Jewish history. Again, the problem, I think, is that the ideology is highly mismatched with the demography. The ideology is that Jews should be living here because it is ours. The demography, unfortunately, is that the number of Palestinian Arabs who are going to become increasingly committed to violence and terror as a means of resistance, not saying it's legitimate resistance, saying their movement will embrace these tactics. They vastly outnumber the number of Jews in these territories. And even today, there are probably the better part of 500,000 Jewish settlers living in the West Bank. But we're talking that that's about a quarter of the number of Palestinians who are living in the West Bank. So the problem with the settlement movement is I would describe it as a demographic problem. It is also an ideological problem, but it's mostly a political problem for Israel. And it's a security problem, because Israel today sees no way to withdraw from the West Bank, and Israel has ample evidence that every time it tries to evacuate Jewish settlers from territories, which they did in Gaza in 2005, it doesn't actually tamp down violence from the Palestinians, it amplifies it. And the story goes, at least the Israeli story goes, that every time we do this, the Palestinians interpret this, the Arab world interprets it as weakness, and therefore sees an opportunity to assert itself even more strongly and violently. So this is like the Gordian knot of the territories. We'll talk a lot more about it next week. In sum, and I wrote this, I mean, a lot of these notes, I wrote all my notes, but they're culled from various sources. Gordis is my primary source, but a lot of others, and there's some great stuff you can watch online. But this is what I wrote in my notes. In sum, it is fair to say that the Six-Day War fuels both the rise of Jewish nationalism and the ideologically motivated Jewish settlement movement, which is made more complicated by the ongoing Israeli presence in the West Bank and Gaza, amid what is now a supermajority of Palestinian Arabs. We're going to focus on the West Bank. Again, Gaza is more, I think Gaza is actually much easier to talk about. We got out of Gaza. Gaza, when anyone who talks about Gaza is occupied, is you can push back immediately and say, no, hasn't been for 18 years. There are no, and by the way, occupied is a problematic term. What do you do with, I mean, the Palestinians see themselves as a nation. They see themselves as a nation, but they are a nation without a state. And Israel, occupation is when a sovereign power uses its military or other means to go into another sovereign nation and stay there and take its land. So there's no doubt in my mind that what happened in February of 22 and previously in Crimea was the occupation of Ukraine by Russian forces, right? If we accept that Ukraine is a sovereign democratic nation and that Russian is a sovereign nation, not democratic. That's very different from achieving territorial gain in war and then just not having means to give all of it back. We're going to talk next time after we talk about the Yom Kippur War about Israel's serious efforts in diplomacy with Egypt to create the most durable peace in the entire region, a peace that has now lasted for the better part of 45 years between Egypt and Israel, where they jointly administer the blockades on Gaza, by the way, because it's in both countries' interest to do so. But in order to do that, the territorial compromise was give back the Sinai, which Israel did. We'll talk about all that next week. So I believe that Israel has significant problems on their hand. That I want to make sure that the language is so combustible, right? Just using these words elicits strong feeling, and they're loaded, and that's just a word that I think we can talk about. We can talk about what occupation means. We can also talk about what occupation doesn't mean. I don't think it's a word that we can't talk about. When anyone comes to me, though, and says, settler colonialist, apartheid, white supremacist, stop. Just stop. Thank you for repeating the Palestinian talking points. Okay, I want to finish my notes here. So what I wrote was, at the same time that the Six-Day War is fueling the rise of Jewish nationalism and the settlement movement, not among all. By the way, the settlement movement has always had detractors and supporters in Israel. And I would say a majority of Israelis are either very mixed or not supportive of the settler movement. The problem is it's a movement that's been going on for 55 years, 56 years. 56 years. So that's problematic. But the garden variety Israelis are like not united in support of the settler movement, nor are they united in what to do about it. Okay. At the same time, you see the rise of an ideologically motivated Palestinian nationalism, which soon begins to embrace terrorism, among other tactics, in its stated desire to eradicate the Jewish state. The PLO's objectives, and this is really important, it was true in 1964, it is true in 2023. The PLO's objectives are not about resistance to occupation, even though they use that word, because it's a great propaganda talking point. Their argument is about resisting the right of Israel to exist at all. Hence, from the river to the sea. In August of 1970, Arafat says this publicly: the Palestinian revolution's basic concern is the uprooting of the Zionist entity from our land and liberating it. Now, how is Arafat going to achieve this? Well, here are some examples. Starting in the late 60s, early 70s, Palestinian nationalism takes the form of numerous hijackings and the 1970 sabotage of a Swiss airplane that killed 47 passengers, 17 of whom are Israelis. And of course, the most infamous episode is in the summer of 1972 in Munich. Go watch the movie. I mean, it's like a great, Spielberg, about the murder of 11 Israeli athletes. And not just murder, like torture and castration, like horrific. You want to see what happened on October 7th? You want to understand what happened on October 7th? Munich. Pardon? The name of the movie is Munich. Yeah. This, by the way, is not just an Israeli problem. Palestinian terrorism is such a problem that in September of 1971, King Hussein of Jordan cracks down on the Palestinians in infamous month-long crackdown known as Black September, the result of which is 2,000 PLO fighters are killed and thousands of Palestinian non-combatants are killed. It makes what's happening in Gaza look like a walk in the park. What Hussein did to the Palestinians, which is amazing, his own people, right? And this is another one of those things that if you really want to get me on edge and talk about why is the world not in an uproar about that, or why is the world not in an uproar about the fact that Assad in Syria, in the worst, bloodiest war of recent memory, just absolutely used every kind of weapon, including chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, against his own people, Muslims on Muslims, Arabs against Arabs. Muslim is a religion, Muslim is a religious identification, Arab is a geo-ethnic identification. Who's an Arab? Basically a person whose first language is Arabic, but not necessarily. Okay, finishing up. So the Black September crackdown forces PLO leadership to flee. They're expelled from Jordan, and they go to southern Lebanon. And wherever the Palestinians go, chaos ensues because the unrest in Lebanon will absolutely tear it apart, and it will lead to where we are next week. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to get to the rise of Palestinian nationalism. So next week we have to do Yom Kippur, Lebanon, and the peace process, which is really interesting. Like the first efforts at trying to achieve a resolution not through war but through peace begin in the late 70s and have continued to the present day. And again, just so you understand, I don't view Israeli history as like one horrible thing after another. I actually think that the story of Israel is a story of incredible triumph of a displaced people to return home. But we're talking about the conflict in this class. So, questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah, Ken.
Was there ever any serious effort to unify the Arab nations against the Jews?
Yeah, that was Nasser's whole thing. No. Oh, thank you. You actually, I skipped over one really important note, and I know that I'm going to get an email about it. This is really interesting. 1967, right? So the PLO is now 3 years old. And the Six-Day War has just happened. So what did the Arab world say after the Six-Day War? I mean, the Six-Day War was humiliated. Who said the word no? 3 no's, right? Thank you. Steve Saba got it. Shortly after the war ended, later in June, apparently, this is really interesting, though it's never been independently corroborated, Israel did vote to return the Sinai to Egypt, like immediately, and return the Golan Heights to Syria immediately in exchange for a permanent peace settlement. But the decision was not made public, and it was never diplomatically conveyed to any Arab state. The Arab League, which was the attempt to unite the Arab countries of the Middle East, but when I say Middle East, that includes countries in what we think of as Africa. It convened in Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan, long before the Sudanese horrific genocide and civil war of beginning in the early 2000s. At the 1967 summit, 8 Arab nations rejected any peaceful settlement with Israel. These nations are Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, and Sudan. And it formulates a policy called the 3 no's, N-O. No peace, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. And that, in part, is what prompted Nasser, recently reinstated after the humiliating defeat of the Six-Day War, to say, okay, war of attrition. We'll just keep shelling. We'll make it clear we do not accept the presence of Israel anywhere in the Sinai close to the Suez. But so, yeah, the united Arab position until the Abraham Accords of 2018, right, under the Trump administration, but also very much directly negotiated with Israel and a handful of Gulf states, decided for the first time since the Khartoum, the Arab League summit in 1967, to say, maybe we want to do business with Israel. Maybe there's something in it for us. Maybe we can extract a promise from Israel not to annex the West Bank formally, and therefore present ourselves as good for the Palestinians. And by the way, maybe we can get some of those nice Israeli arms that they're so good at. And maybe we can do some economic cooperation with this nation since they're a major player in the world economy, right? So a few Arab states broke with the long-standing consensus of no peace, no recognition, no negotiation. That started in 2018. It's one of the reasons I'm a huge proponent of the Abraham Accords, because I think that international cooperation in a global society is the most viable pathway to a more peaceful and stable Middle East and world order. What do I know about it? I'm just a teacher of Torah. Any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, Lenny. Do I think that the Oh, in their mind it did. Of course, I don't think so. I mean, oh, no, absolutely, absolutely. The Arab narrative, the Palestinian narrative, which has been embraced by most of the Arab world, again, the defectors are the states that have signed on to the Abraham Accords, including the UAE, the Emirates, Bahrain, another small Gulf state, but very, very rich in petrodollars, Morocco and Sudan have all decided to recognize Israel. And just before October 7th, all of the headlines in Israel this past summer, I know this because I was in Israel in June and July, all of the conversation was about the Saudis and about the talks that had been taking place between Israel and the Saudis, there's more than just speculation. It is widely accepted that one of the strategic aims of October 7th was Hamas was going to use October 7th to scuttle, to disrupt the growing closeness between Israel and the Saudis. But yeah, at the end of the day, the Palestinians commemorate Israel's independence, May of 1948, as Nakba, right? They call it the catastrophe, which is what it means. So, yes, in their narrative, the establishment of the state of Israel is the wound. It is the reason for Palestinian resistance. And that's why I really have come to believe that despite all of the talking points that all the Palestinians want is an end to quote-unquote occupation, where if you accept that at face value, that means a return to the 1967 borders. And all of the peace arrangements that we're going to talk about next time have been premised on a loosely accepted set of common understandings that Israel would withdraw from most of the West Bank, Jerusalem would be in a way shared, internationalized, some way of recognizing that it's also the capital of the Palestinian future state as well as the Jewish state. Cessation of hostilities, recognition of mutual recognition, all of those things. One of the sticking points is this so-called Palestinian right of return. Let's leave that off the table for now. But the problem is, I believe that both Palestinian leadership, but especially the Palestinian street, and absolutely Hamas and the Gaza street, the street meaning the public opinion, is that when they talk about ending the occupation, they're not talking about 1967. They're talking about 1948. And that to me is like, again, you want to talk about narratives that don't line up? For us, 1967 is where we entered lands that are then and today predominantly of Palestinian population. And Israel, when I say we, Israel took over, won them in the war, and has not given them back for really good reasons. By the way, I mean, we've seen this. Thank God we didn't give back the Golan prior to the Syrian civil war, among many, many, many other reasons, mostly security related. And by the way, I don't think it's because Israel wants its military in the West Bank. Israel definitely does not want its military in the West Bank, but it doesn't have a good solution to this problem because Palestinians have not shown themselves willing to accept terms that actually address 1967. They even just listen to what Sinwar, the representative of Hamas, the leader of Hamas, I think speaking from a nice hotel in Qatar, by the way. He's based every single Hamas talking point since October 7th has been about the extirpation of the Zionist entity from Palestine. And they're not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. They're talking about Haifa. They're talking about Jerusalem. They're talking about Tel Aviv. They're talking about Modi'in. They're talking about Kiryat Shmona in the north. They're talking about the Negev and Beersheba. They're talking about Israel. They're talking about Israel. So that is why I'm not so hopeful that this conflict's getting resolved this year. Yeah, Lauren Blum.
So we've established that Arab nations sort of see Israel as a blemish of Arab rule in the Middle East and North Africa.
The Arab League.
Yeah, the Arab League. And now, when you were going over their talking points of anti-Zionist behavior, those sentiments are being echoed today through the media.
Right.
All over left, right.
Right. We're going to talk about this next time because in the kind of arsenal of Palestinian tactics in their so-called liberation movement, I mean, one of the reasons that Israel has right to be circumspect about working with the Palestinians is their embrace of terror, their rejection of the legitimacy of the Jewish state, their unwillingness to withdraw from their claim to the right of return. But the other big one is that even when they haven't been engaged in violence or when they've been blocked, for instance, by the very effective security barrier that was really built mostly in 2004, 2005 after the Second Intifada. We'll get to all this next week. They embraced a tactic of they leaned hard into a tactic of generating sympathy for their cause through boycott, divestment, sanctions, and propaganda. So the Palestinians have actually been very adept, I think, and very concerted in waging a war for hearts and minds, and a war that is waged in talking points, sound bites, social media, and, by the way, investing heavily in academia in the West. There's a lot to be said that I don't have the time or expertise to say today, but there's a lot that has been revealed only in recent weeks about the amount of, follow the money, right? About the amount of pro-Palestinian or Palestinian or Qatari money in higher academia in America. It's very disturbing, right? So if you can't create legitimacy through terror and violence, try creating it through with social media as your tool. It's very dangerous. And this is one in which I think that, Israel's gotten a bit licked on this front. I feel, or at least to say, I feel that as a supporter of Israel, I often feel on the defensive when I see what's on social media, which is why I'm advising most young people simply to withdraw from social media. I know there's a cost to that too. There's a cost to that too. Some say, no, Blake, it's just the opposite. You got to teach your kids to push back. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that anything that happens on social media can actually make a difference for the good. Badly. It affects it a lot and badly. And by the way, it's the general narrative that's been accepted since 1975, which we haven't gotten to 1975 yet. We ended today in 1972. We ended in Munich, if you just are following the chronology of my class. The UN in 1975 says Zionism is racism. One of the easiest talking points to remember. The only problem with it is it's false. We'll get to that. But it is a reason that, by the way, particularly among the left, particularly among the community that adopts intersectionality as its kind of overarching ideology, which states that basically it makes a overly simplified equation between virtue and powerlessness, that the less power you have, the more your cause is just and the more your tactics are justified, which I think is a moral stain on that doctrine, on that ideology. It's hugely problematic. I mean, by that measure, then nothing America ever does or can do can be virtuous because we have power, right? And because a lot of that power was accumulated through blood and treasure on the backs of indigenous populations and enslaved Africans. So in intersectional theory, America is stained from the beginning, right? I mean, then you get into critical race theory and all sorts of other problems. But I have to go. Have a great week. Happy Hanukkah. Come on Thursday.